How many people here have lied at least once since the beginning of 2016, in general? The last month, the last hour. I'm not going to ask you how many of you had lied since you entered this conference. But we do it all the time. We do it all the time. And at the same time that we admit that we lie quite frequently, how many people here view themselves in general as honest, wonderful people? Same group? How does it work out? So before I tell you something about dishonesty, before I kind of bash it, I want to say some good things about dishonesty. There's a story that God comes to Sarah. And he says, Sarah, you're going to have a child. And Sarah laughs. And she said, how can I have a child when my husband is so old? And God says, don't worry, you'll have a child. And then God goes to Abraham. He says, Abraham, you're going to have a son. And Abraham says, did you tell Sarah? And God says, yes. And Abraham says, and what did Sarah say? And God lies. God says, Sarah said, how could she have a son when she is so old? And the religious scholar wondered, how could God lie? And they came to the conclusion that it's okay to lie for peace at home. Shalom bayit. And if you think about it, this is really what dishonesty is all about. Yes, dishonesty is a human value, but there are other human values. And what happens when some human values contradict each other, when they bump heads? Which one wins? And at least in the Jewish tradition with this story, it's not always that honesty wins. So let's think about how this conflict happened and what can we learn from it. And also importantly, what can we do on the policy side? Right? What is the theory of dishonesty, and therefore what is the right theory for trying to prevent dishonesty? Now, just to be clear, the prevalent theory of dishonesty from the legal perspective is the theory of cost-benefit analysis. It says that when people think about being dishonest, they think about what can I gain, what can I lose, let me weigh those things and figure out if this is a worthwhile act of dishonesty or not. And because of that, we think that punishment is just going to fix everything, right? Because if people are forward-looking, and we think what is the cost and what's the benefit, if there's a big cost on the other end, we're not going to become dishonest. But think about this from just your personal experience. How many people here, how many you had like an experience like this, that you went to your friends for dinner, and you went to their bathroom to wash your hands, and they have these new wonderful towels. And you don't have nice towels at home, and you could take their towels and go home and nobody would find out. Or you went to a restaurant and they have this really nice cutlery, and nicer than the one you have at home. How often does it happen? And you even think to yourself, yes, I would love to take this cutlery, and the probability of being caught is very low. Let's engage in this activity. Not that high, right? So if you think about it, this idea of cost-benefit analysis doesn't describe much about our personal experience. It also doesn't describe much in terms of macro data. Think about something like the death penalty. The death penalty is a big punishment. You can't imagine something bigger. The theory is that people would think forward and they would say, for this kind of crime, I could get a death penalty. Let's not do it. You come home at night, you're pissed off, you go to the kitchen, you take a big knife, and then you say, oh, I forgot, we have a death penalty in this state. Let's do something different. This is not how we function. And by the way, in the experiment, I'll tell you, too, punishment doesn't seem to have the effect. And it's incredibly important to get the right theory, because if we have the wrong theory, like that people do the cost-benefit analysis, our solutions are going to be ineffective, which is what we have. So we have to understand the mechanism if we want to reduce dishonesty. OK, so I'm mostly kind of a simple lab guy. I do little experiments in the lab. But with dishonesty, I also wanted to do some larger scale things. And it's a little hard to get people to steal millions of dollars from you on our research budget. So I became a mediocre amateur anthropologist, and I also started talking to all kinds of big criminals, serious cheaters. And I want to tell you a little bit about my discussions with cheaters and the experiments and how they fit together. One of the first crooks I talked to, his name is Sam. And when Sam was 12 years old, he went to work for his cousin, Eddie. And he worked in a store that sold TV and VCRs and radios and stuff like that. And they taught him the 3 rules of retail. The first rule of retail was that they're going to advertise a very cheap, whatever gadget it is, TV in the newspaper. And the moment people come to the store, 3 different salespeople are going to approach them and tell them that what they were going to buy is not ideal for them and direct them into buying something more expensive. That's called bait and switch. It also tells you that they understood something about social psychology. The second principle of how they taught him to deal in life was to try and get the government out of their business, to deal only with cash, not to give receipts, so they don't have to pay taxes. And the third rule of retail was that every winter they will take all the merchandise they couldn't get rid of, they would put in one corner of the warehouse, they would pretend that the pipes above it broke, they would take a hose, they would wet the merchandise, and they would submit an insurance claim. The insurance company would pay them. Sometime, for a small fee, the insurance company would let them keep the merchandise, in which case they would switch insurance companies and wet the same merchandise again the next year. Anyway, Sam grows up in this environment from age 12. And then when he's 18, he goes to college. And what do you think he goes to study? Accounting. Accounting. He goes to study accounting, and after 2 years of accounting school, he comes back to the family and he says, we have been doing things the wrong way. He said, we have been skimming, taking an amount of money, not paying taxes. This is called skimming. And he says, this is no way to get wealthy. If we want to get seriously wealthy, we need to become a publicly traded company. Let's have an IPO. Then we can dump stocks and really get wealthy. The family listens. Now, to have a successful IPO, you want to show an increase in revenues. Most companies, how do they get an increase in revenues? They work harder. The Antar family has another approach, which is they cheat less. So for the next 4 years, they cheat by 25% less every year. They show what seems to be a dramatic improvement in revenues. They have a very successful IPO, and they dump $100 million worth of stocks. Now, up to this point in the discussion, Sam looks like he has no morals. He doesn't care about cheating to customers, taxes, shareholders, anybody. But this is where the story changed, because I also knew that almost everybody in the family went to jail. So I said, how did that happen? Here's the story. Sam works for his cousin Eddie. Eddie is the son of the patriarch of the family. And Eddie's father was the head of the family. He used to hold court. People would come to him for advice, and he would run the family. All of a sudden, Eddie becomes $100 million richer. Guess what happens? People start going to Eddie for advice. And Eddie's father doesn't like his new position in life. And he tries to change things, but it's really hard to fight $100 million. So Eddie has a wife called Debbie. And behind her back, everybody calls her Debbie 1. He also has a mistress, also called Debbie, and everybody calls her Debbie 2. One New Year Eve, Eddie's father calls Debbie 1 and gives her the address to Debbie 2's apartment. By the way, just stop here for a second. I told you about lots of crimes up to now. The only thing that got a rise out of you was And actually, you're not alone in that, because this was the first point that Sam looks at me in the camera and he says, there are some things you don't do. There are some lines you don't cross. You don't tell a wife about her husband's mistress. Everything else was fine, right? This wasn't. And actually, it wasn't just Sam that thought that this was a moral violation. The whole family split into 2 fractions, and they gave the FBI information about the other part of the family. And Sam said that without that, they would have never caught them because they were so tight with each other. Now, there's lots of things we can say. We can ask what happens to a 12-year-old kid who grows up in this environment. Christina, hopefully your next project will solve this. But we can also ask the question of how much are we all a little bit like Sam? How much do we take some? You see, Sam was not amoral. He basically had two types of domains in life. He had things outside of the family and inside of the family. Outside of the family, there were no morals. But inside of the family, he had very strict morals. His handshake was his handshake, his word was his word, and you don't tell a wife about her husband's mistress. This was all incredibly tight. So think about yourself. How many of you have illegally downloaded materials on your computers? Right? Basically, all the grad students who know how to deal with technology. And the people who don't know just don't know how to do it, right? It's not that you have a moral objection to this. And I think it's kind of the same story, that we took a domain of illegal downloads, and we know it's illegal. We call it illegal downloads. If nobody can say, I don't know. We know it's illegal, but we don't have a moral judgment about this, right? We wouldn't feel embarrassed if somebody found out. Many of you raised your hands. So what happened is that with this case is to think about, could it be that we think about morality in a domain-by-domain specific way, and we apply different rules depending on the domain? And if you think about this, this is what corruption is all about. Corruption is about taking a domain of life and saying, I know this is strictly illegal, but my internal moral judgment is not acting in this domain. So let me tell you about some experiments we've done on corruption. So we have all kinds of ways to measure dishonesty. One of the ones we use is a die task. We give people a die, and we say, why don't you toss the die, and we'll pay you whatever the die comes up on. It comes on 6, we'll pay you $6, $5, and so on. But you can get paid based on the top side or the bottom, top or bottom. You decide, but don't tell us. So if you're in the experiment, I say, please pick top or bottom. Did you decide? Yes. Please mark a check on the piece of paper that you have. You write a check. And then we toss the die, and let's say it comes with 5 on the bottom and 2 on the top. And then I say, what did you pick? Top or bottom? Now, if you picked bottom, no problem. You say bottom and you get $5. If you pick top, now you have a dilemma. Do you say the truth, top, and get $2? Or do you change your mind? You say, oh, I really thought about bottom, and you get $5. And people do this 20 times, and every time they write check, I picked top or bottom. You toss the die, you write 5 and 2, and then you say what you picked, and you keep on doing this. And when people do this 20 times, we find that people are incredibly lucky. And lots of people cheat a little bit. By the way, very few people are perfectly lucky, but people are a little extra lucky. 14 times, 13, 15 times, they get the right side. And luck, by the way, has a very nice feature. It concentrates more on the 6-1 die tossers than the 3-4 die tossers. OK, so this is one of the basic paradigm we measure dishonesty. Now, consider the following experiment. People come to the lab, and we say, look, we have this game, the die game, and we describe it to them. And we say, we have 2 versions of this game today, and the way they are different from each other is the exchange rate between dots and money. There's one version in which you can expect to make $4. There's another version in which you can expect to make $40. That's the only difference, the exchange rate. Please toss a coin, and we'll see which version you got, the $4 version or the $40 version. People toss a coin, and no matter what they come up with, we say, oh, sorry, you got the $4 version. But now the research assistant looks around, and he says, psst, listen. He said, my boss is not here today, so I'll tell you what. You got $3 to show up as a show-up fee. If you'll give me those $3, I will pretend you got the other coin flip. What do you think is the percentage of students I teach at Duke? What do you think is the percentage of our students who bribe the experimenter? This is a group of psychologists. That's great to ask. How many people think it's around 10%? Around 10. OK. Between 0 and 25. By the way, if you raised your hand for 10, you should keep. Between 25 and 50? Between 50 and 75? Ah. Above 75? Above 85? OK, interesting. 90%. 90%. And by the way, I don't think it's Duke. I think it's just general. And just to be clear, we've ran these experiments on more than 40,000 people, different versions. Nobody has ever come to us and offered us a bribe. Nobody came and said, oh, I see you have lots of money here for participants. If I'll pay you a little bit more, can I get some? But the moment we offer them a bribe, the vast majority of people, the moment we asked for a bribe, the vast majority of people bribed us. And what do you think happened after they bribed? Two things. They cheated more, and they started stealing. Now, what do I mean by started stealing? So I told you what cheating is. You basically say you got the other side of the die. And people make this list. And when they finish, they sum up and they say, I deserve $23, let's say. And then we give them an envelope with $50. And we say, why don't you pay yourself? The money you did not make, leave in the envelope. And as you leave the room, there's a big box with lots of envelope. Drop the envelope there with all the money you didn't make. Now, generally, we find that people cheat but don't steal. The moment people write $23, they take $23. We even did this experiment outside of the parole office in downtown Durham. We waited for people to get out of parole, and we did this experiment with them. Even those criminals, right? These are people coming out of parole, cheated that did not steal. This corruption experiment I just described to you was the first time we saw real stealing. And that's incredibly troubling, right? Because it says that you can basically educate somebody to be honest, and generally people, cheat a little bit, but contain ourselves. And all of a sudden, people come to a system that the person running that system is telling them the system is corrupt. And just like that, people switch, become very, very different people. And you can say, what do we do with policy, for example, politics? What are the odds that we will have somebody fresh and new and pure in government or in any country that has some corruption? How long will it take them to change? By the way, we also ran this experiment when we asked people for $12 bribe. That was too expensive. Nobody bribed us. But even then, people cheated more and stole. So it wasn't as if people were trying to get a return on their $3. It was really about the understanding of what the system is all about. The second story I want to tell you is a story about a guy called Walt. Walt was an account executive at MCI. He was in charge of AT&T and IBM and big accounts. He would send people bills, companies bills for tens of millions of dollars sometimes, and they would pay him. And sometimes they would argue, but mostly he would deal with very respectable people. As MCI was getting bigger and bigger, they were trying to get more customers, and they were getting less savory customers. 900 numbers, reading the cards, predicting the future, phone sex, all kinds of things like that. And those businesses were much smaller, and often they didn't want to pay for the services. And Walt became a bill collector. All of a sudden, he would have to go to their offices and threaten them and try to get them to pay. It was very, very tough, and he didn't like that job. So he called the people who signed them up and said, the people you signed up are not paying. Cut their phones. And those people said, it's our job to get new customers. It's your job to get them to pay. We're doing our job. You do your job. Anyway, he struggled. And by the way, in modern accounting, the moment you send somebody a bill, you could book it as if you got the revenue, discounted from the probability you will not get paid. Now, what that means is that if you have a bill that somebody is not paying, you're penalized twice. Once because you don't get the money, and the second because you have to discount all the other bills as well. So there's tremendous pressure on Walt to basically get these bills not to show up as if they are not paying them. Anyway, at some point he goes to the accounting department, he sits next to the computer, and he takes a big debt of one of these companies and replaces it with zero. He said, they're not going to pay anyway. Let's just erase their debt. And he keeps on doing this, and people are happy with him. Nobody knows exactly what's going on, but it looks like the debt is going on. The accountants are happy. He gets promoted. Life is good. He keeps on replacing numbers with zero for a year and a half. After a year and a half, he doesn't know how long can he continue doing this. So he goes to his previous boss, and he described to him what he's been doing. And he said, what do we do? How can I continue? And his previous boss says, here is what you do. Go to the next customer, threaten them that unless they're going to pay, you're going to shut them down, then come back to the office, replace their debt with zero, and call me, your previous boss. I'll handle it from there. He goes, he threatens, come back, calls his previous boss. His previous boss goes to that company, and he says, I'm an investor. You have an interesting company here. Show me the books. Maybe I could invest. They show him the books, and he sees this big debt to MCI. And he says, I'll pay MCI directly this debt. Of course, he knows he doesn't have to. He said, in return, I want you to do two things. One is you're going to send a check of this amount every month to this account in the Cayman Islands. And the second thing you're going to do is you're going to restructure and start paying MCI on time every month. And they do. And money comes to MCI, and Walt is happy. And they do it with another client and another client and another client. Eventually, of course, he gets caught, and he spends 9 years in prison. But the thought about this is to ask ourselves the question, when Walt started cheating, was he cheating for himself? No, he was actually cheating for MCI. He was taking tremendous risk on himself and actually cheating for a company. By the way, it's very hard to figure out what's happening with Volkswagen. I'm trying very hard to figure out where things started there. But I suspect it's the same thing. I can't imagine people sitting there at the boardroom and saying, let's pollute the world for slightly higher revenue for a little while. And I think what happened is the same thing. There was somebody who was under some pressure to improve the quality of diesel, and they found some ways to show as if the quality of diesel improved. I don't know it, but I'm speculating. And so Walt started cheating for the company, and later on, when he started cheating for himself, what was happening is that he actually didn't do anything different. He was doing the same thing. Somebody else was dealing with the dirty laundry, and from his perspective, things are better because people started paying MCI. So let's consider the following experiment. Imagine you're playing the die game, and in one condition, you sit there and you play it by yourself. Another condition, your significant other is sitting next to you. Now, your significant other doesn't know what's in your mind. Are you cheating? Are you not cheating? But they see the list, and you basically can guess whether you're extra lucky or not. What do you think? Do people cheat more or less on the same when they sit next to the significant others? How many people think it's the same? More? Less? OK, it's more. Why more? I'll tell you about another experiment, then we'll come back to this. Imagine you play the same game, and I connected you to a lie detector. Now we can first ask the question of, can the lie detector detect when people are lying in this method? And the answer is yes. Not all the time, but we can measure when people are lying. In another condition, people lie for a charity. They pick the charity that they love most of all, and all the money they make goes to that charity. What happens when the money goes to charity? People cheat more, and the lie detector doesn't detect anything. Why? Because what is the lie detector detecting? It's detecting attention. I want more money, but I think it's bad. I want more money, but I think it's bad. What happens when we don't think it's bad? We can cheat more, and we don't feel bad about it. By the way, this is why I think also politicians have such an easy time lying. Right? Because it's very easy for them to convince themselves that it's actually for us that they're lying to us. Because if they only got elected, our lives will be so much more wonderful. So let's go back to our experiment. What happens when you sit next to your significant other? All of a sudden, you're not just cheating for yourself, you're cheating for the whole family. Right? And you feel better about the whole endeavor in the same way that Walt was cheating for the group as a whole, not just for himself. OK. The last story I want to tell you is a story about a cyclist called Joe Pep. Joe was a cyclist on the Olympic team. At some point, he went back to finish his undergrad. He comes out of undergrad 2 years later, goes on a race, and he feels he's doing just as well as he did before. He went back to college, but everybody else is a little faster. And he cries that night because cycling is really what he loves to do, and he's frustrated. And one of his friends gives him an address to go and see a physician. He goes to see this physician, white coat, stethoscope, and the physician gives him a prescription for EPO. EPO is a drug used for cancer to increase the production of red blood cells, right? More oxygen, really good for an endurance athlete. He gets this prescription, he goes to the pharmacy, he gives it to the pharmacist, his insurance company pays for it, he pays the deductible. He takes the injections to his room, he has other injections he gives himself, legal things, but vitamins and so on. He adds that, he gives himself EPO. The next day, he gives himself EPO. A few weeks later, he finds out that other people in the team are doing it. They're doing it together. Then he moves to another team in which everybody is not just taking the drugs together, but they also discuss it more openly. Later on, there's a shortage of EPO. But he has friends on the Chinese team, and they put him in touch with a Chinese factory that produces EPO, and he imports some for himself and for his team. Another team hears about it. They ask him to import EPO for them as well, which he does. Eventually, he's a drug dealer. Now, think about this. And this is true, by the way, to almost everybody we talk to. When you look at crimes, a lot of the cases, it's about a slippery slope. You know, we tend to look at what people did at the end, and we say, me being a drug dealer? I can't imagine that. But actually, think about the path of Joe Pep and ask yourself, when would you have stopped? Cycling is everything you dreamed and loved. You're doing bad in a race. Somebody gives you an address for a physician. Don't you go? Of course you go. They give you a prescription for EPO. Don't you go to the pharmacy? Of course you go. They give you all these injections. Don't you take one? You do. And then don't you take the next one? And like, when exactly would we stop? And by the way, the troubling thought here is that, you know, because of the commonality and because of the danger of the first step, what is the difference between people who commit crime and not? Is it just opportunity? Right? Is it just the slippery slope? And what is the first step? At the end of the day, what we found is that when we change the amount of reward we give people, when the amount they stand to gain goes all the way from 10 cents per dot or per question to $10 per question, we don't see increased cheating. When we change the probability of being caught, we don't see much happening. Sadly, the IRB is not letting us punish people, but you know, I suspect that the results will be the same. What we find is that it's all about the ability to rationalize dishonesty. Right? People basically try to maximize two things at the same time. We want to be able to look in the mirror and feel good about ourselves. We want to feel that we're wonderful, great people. At the same time, we want to benefit a little bit from dishonesty. And you can say, you can't do both. Well, you can, as long as you cheat just a little bit. As long as we cheat just a little bit, we can cheat a little bit and still feel good about it. And the question is, like, under what conditions can we cheat a bit more and still feel good about it? And things that help are, it's not for me, it's for other people, everybody else is doing it, and so on. I'll tell you about two other experiments on this. One is not really an experiment, it's a study. I own a vending machine. It's not a second business, it's just a good experimental machine. And in this particular experiment study, we set up the machine to say 75 cents on each of the candy on the outside, but we set the machine to say 0 on the inside. So what does it mean? You would put your money in, you would press the button, you would get all the money back, everything is more than 0, plus your candy. And we had the big sign that says, if something is wrong with the machine, please call this number. And it was my cell phone number. Question 1, what percentage of people called? 0, that's right. And how many candies did people take? Nobody took more than 4. The majority took 3 or 4. Nobody took 5. Right? Because 5 will be stealing. And you can think to yourself how people rationalize it, right? They probably said something like, I remember this other vending machine that took my money and didn't give me a candy. And this other vending machine must be a close relative of this one. And we're just sorting out the vending karma in the world. By the way, we also found out that after 2008, it was very easy to convince people that they have been wrongly suffering because of other people, and that increases the amount that people are willing to cheat. Another very troubling experiment was the following. People did some tasks, and at the end of the task, they came to the experiment and it told them how much money they deserve. I deserve $6. In another version of the experiment, they did not ask for money, they asked for tokens. I deserve 6 tokens. And they took those tokens and they walked 12 feet to the side and changed them for money. So the only difference was that sometimes you look people in the eyes and you lie for money, and sometimes you look them in the eyes, you lie for tokens that will become money very quickly. What's the difference? The idea for this came from a little joke, and the joke is that little Johnny comes home from school with a note from the teacher that said that little Johnny stole a pencil from the kid who's sitting next to him. And Johnny's father is furious. And he said, I can't believe you stole this pencil. You're grounded for 2 weeks. And then he said, and Johnny, you know very well that if you need a pencil, all you need to do is to say something. You could just mention it. You could just ask, and I can bring you dozens of pencils from the office. So what happens? So what happens when people look you in the eyes and don't lie for money, they lie for a token? Our participants double their cheating. And if you think about it, as a society, we're moving away from tangible representation of lots of things. We're moving from cash to credit to stock options to derivatives, moving with dealing with people directly to dealing over great distances. Could it be that it's a psychological distance as we increase? It allows people to behave in a worse way but still think of ourselves in a good way. And if it does, and I think it does, what are the precautions we should have under those systems? If you think about everything I've said so far, everything is really about conflicts of interests. It's about the fact that if we are driven to see the world in a certain way, we see the world in that way. And we as psychologists know that conflicts of interest are very hard to overcome. And this is why I think that when we try to regulate dishonesty, we often regulate just the punishment. But in fact, what we need to do is to understand how corrosive conflicts of interest are and try to eliminate them as much as we can. And if you think about any lesson we've learned from the financial crisis, it was how important conflicts of interest were. It's my alarm, it's not the phone. Can I take 5 more minutes? Okay. So we've learned that conflicts of interest are incredibly corrosive, but we haven't really done anything on that regard. In that regard, by the way, we also as scientists have to be careful. I'll tell you about my own experience. I used to teach at MIT, and the nice people at Harvard used to let us run experiments in their lab. And one of the nice things about their lab is that their lab also had real people, well, not just students. And one day we ran this experiment with real people, and there's one, and the results basically look kind of like we hoped they would look like, but there's one person in the group we hoped would perform well that is just performing terribly. And we look at the data, and there's like one person who's just pulling the mean down. It was a group-based experiment. It was just like terrible data point. And we looked at him carefully, and he was 20 years older than anybody else, and we remembered one very, very drunk old gentleman who came to the lab. And he was so memorable, and you couldn't stand close to him to talk to him. He was so stinking from alcohol. It was just terrible. And we said, you know, drunk people, who can have drunk people in the experiment? Let's just kick them out, and the result looked much nicer. And then we thought about it a week later, and we said, actually, one of the students, Daniel, said, what if that drunk person would have been in the other group? First of all, we said we probably would have never looked. And if we did look, what would we have said? We said probably, yeah, we need more drunk people in the experiment. And, you know, and at that point, when we were looking at the data this way, we felt that by taking him out, we were kind of cleaning up the data. We were like cleaning up the weeds and clearing a path. But of course, we weren't. There was a particular version of reality we wanted to see, and we were using our creativity to justify seeing that path. And we were not cheating anybody else, we were cheating ourselves. Right? Because if that experiment did not really work out, we would have gone spending another year and lots of money and time of the students on all kinds of things that are irrelevant. And it's not protecting from other people, it's protecting from our own creativity and our own ability to convince ourselves in what we want. I also want to say something about solutions. So we said rationalization is the heart of these problems, and every time we can rationalize, we can cheat more. What can we do about it? So there's all kinds of things. We can reduce psychological distance. There's everything I've told you, we could do the opposite. But the other thing we can do is we can think about psychological reminders. There's a little joke that a guy goes to the rabbi, and he said, Rabbi, somebody stole my bicycle from synagogue. And the rabbi said, this is terrible, this is awful, stealing your bicycle from synagogue. I can't believe this is happening. He said, come to synagogue next week and sit in the front row. And as we go over the 10 Commandments, turn around and look at everybody in the eyes. And when you get to thou shalt not steal, see who can't look you in the eyes, you'll know that's your thief. The guy's excited, the rabbi is excited, comes to synagogue, sits in the front row, turns around you in the 10 Commandments. After the service, he goes to the rabbi and he says, Rabbi, you wouldn't believe it. It worked like magic. He said it worked like a charm. He says the moment we got to thou shalt not commit adultery, I remembered where I left my bike. You're wondering where's the experiment? We went to UCLA and we asked about 500 undergrads to try and recall the 10 Commandments. What percentage of them do you think recalled all 10 Commandments? 0. They invented lots of interesting new ones. What happened after we asked them to try and recall the 10 Commandments? Nobody cheated. We repeated this by asking self-declared atheists to swear on the Bible, and even they stopped cheating. We did a similar experiment with an insurance company that we got some people to sign at the top of the form and some at the bottom. Think about most of the forms. What happens? You fill the form, you fill the form, you fill the form, and then you sign at the end. By that time, you finish cheating. It's over. It's done. You're not going to say, oh, I have to sign. Let me go back and revise the form. And by the way, in the oral tradition, it is so clear to us that you need to sign up front. If you went to court, when should you swear, in the beginning or at the end? Of course, at the beginning. We understand that it's all about priming. It's not about verification. But somehow in the legal tradition, we forgot that. Right? So what we did was we got some people to sign at the end of the form, some people to sign at the bottom of the form, and reduce cheating by a lot. David, tell me that the US government in the procurement procedures are implementing this approach. There's now a government in South America that has decreased cheating on taxes quite nicely using that as well. So there is hope, and I think as long as we understand where dishonesty has come from, we could do something. I want to say one last thing, which is to say something about cultural differences. How many of you grew up in countries outside of the US? Just keep your hands up. And how many of you think that keep your hands up. And how many of you think that in your country of origin, people cheat less than Americans? Less than Americans, keep your hands up. Less than Americans. Less than Americans. Let's see. Canadian? Dutch. I know, it's not fair. Where are you from? Canada, yeah, of course. Okay. So I grew up in Israel. The first country I went to test was Israel. How many of you think the Israelis cheat more in our experiments than Americans? You know what? That's very surprising. I mean, it's a test of political correctness. It's not really a test of your beliefs about Israelis. Usually, it's the people in the back row that raise your hands, not Barbara. The Israelis cheat just the same. Francesca Gino, my Italian collaborator, said, come to Italy. We'll show you what the Italians can do. The Italians cheat just the same. We tried Turkey, China, Portugal, Germany, the UK, Canada, Colombia, South Africa, Kenya. I think that's about it. Basically no differences. How can it be that we don't find differences? Everybody who's traveled knows that things feel very differently in different places. And I think this is actually a general lesson about psychology. When we do our experiments are abstract and general. They're not connected to any particular culture, and because of that, culture norms don't apply to it in any way. Culture does matter tremendously in the way we talked about Sam. Culture can come and say illegal downloads, don't worry about it. Culture can come and say paying taxes, don't worry about it. Culture can come and say something like cheating in exams at school doesn't really matter. Culture doesn't change the backbone of humanity. It changes domain by domain specific how we approach life. Let me end with one final joke. I told you a little bit about Judaism and Christianity. A guy goes to confession. And he says, forgive me, Father, for I have sinned. And the father said, what have you done, my son? And the guy said, I'm 65 years old, and I just had sex with two 25-year-old girls. And the preacher is appalled. He said, I can't believe you're doing this. This is terrible. This is awful. I want you to go around the church 1,000 times and give $1,000 to charity and say 1,000 times Hail Mary. And then he says, and how long has it been since your last confession? He says, I've never been to confession. What? You're 65 years old and you've never been to confession? How could that be? He says, I'm Jewish. So the priest said, so if you're Jewish, what are you doing here and why are you telling me? He said, I'm telling everybody.